Welcome to Midnight in Murder. Tonight we have a UK special. Let's go. Case 1. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. In the fog-shrouded streets of Edwardian London, few cases captured the public imagination quite like that of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. Born in Michigan in 1862, Crippen had come to London seeking a new life, but instead became the center of one of the most sensational murder trials of the early 20th century. His story begins not with violence, but with love, jealousy, and the gradual dissolution of a marriage that would end in tragedy. Dr. Crippen was a small, mild-mannered man with a receding hairline and thick spectacles that gave him an almost scholarly appearance. He worked as a homeopathic doctor and patent medicine salesman, though his qualifications were questionable by British medical standards. In 1892, he had married Cora Turner, a woman with aspirations of becoming a music hall performer who later adopted the stage name Belle Elmore. Their marriage, which had begun with promise, gradually deteriorated over the years as Belle's career failed to materialize and their relationship grew increasingly strained. Belle Elmore was everything her husband was not. Where Crippen was quiet and unassuming, Belle was loud and attention-seeking. She had a penchant for expensive clothes and jewelry, often spending beyond their means to maintain an appearance of success that her career never quite achieved. She was also known to be unfaithful, carrying on numerous affairs that humiliated her husband publicly. Despite this, Crippen seemed to endure her behavior with remarkable patience, at least on the surface. The couple lived at 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Camden, North London, a modest terraced house that Belle had filled with the trappings of her imagined success. She hosted gatherings for other aspiring performers and maintained an active social life, while Crippen worked long hours to support their lifestyle. Their lodger, a young typist named ElevenLabs, had become increasingly important to Crippen. Ethel was everything Belle was not: quiet, devoted, and genuinely caring toward the doctor. As 1909 turned to 1910, the tension in the Crippen household reached a breaking point. Belle had discovered her husband's affair with Ethel and had threatened to leave him, taking with her their joint savings and leaving him in financial ruin. She had also humiliated him publicly at social gatherings, making no secret of her own infidelities while condemning his relationship with Ethel. For a man who valued respectability above almost everything else, this public humiliation was becoming unbearable. On January 31, 1910, Belle Elmore disappeared. According to Crippen, she had received urgent word that a relative in America was dying and had left immediately for the United States. He explained to friends and Belle's theatrical associates that she had been forced to leave so quickly that there was no time for proper goodbyes. This explanation seemed plausible enough, though some found it odd that Belle, who loved drama and attention, would leave without making a grand scene of her departure. As weeks turned to months, Crippen's behavior began to raise suspicions. He had resigned from Belle's theatrical organization, claiming that she had asked him to do so in a letter. More disturbing to Belle's friends was Crippen's increasingly open relationship with ElevenLabs. The young woman had moved into the Hilldrop Crescent house and was openly wearing Belle's jewelry and clothes. When questioned about this, Crippen explained that Belle had left these items behind and had written asking him to give them to someone who could make use of them. In March 1910, Crippen received a letter that would begin his downfall. Belle's friend, Kate Williams, had been growing increasingly suspicious about Belle's sudden departure and prolonged silence. She had written to Belle's sister in America, inquiring about Belle's whereabouts, only to learn that no one in the family had seen or heard from her. This revelation prompted Kate to approach Scotland Yard with her concerns. Chief Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to investigate the disappearance of Belle Elmore. Dew was an experienced detective who had worked on the Jack the Ripper case, though like his colleagues, he had never solved those murders. He was methodical in his approach and had a reputation for thoroughness that made him well-suited to unraveling the mystery of Belle's disappearance. When Dew first interviewed Crippen at his office, the doctor appeared nervous but maintained his story about Belle's sudden departure to America. He provided what seemed to be reasonable explanations for her silence, suggesting that she might be too busy caring for her dying relative to write letters. However, Dew noticed inconsistencies in Crippen's account and decided to search the house at Hilldrop Crescent. The initial search of the house revealed nothing immediately suspicious. The property was neat and tidy, and ElevenLabs was cooperative with the investigation. However, Dew's instincts told him that something was amiss. He noticed that Belle's personal belongings were still in the house, which seemed odd if she had planned to remain in America permanently. More troubling was Crippen's increasingly nervous demeanor and his eagerness to end the interview. After Dew left, Crippen made a decision that would seal his fate. Rather than maintain his innocence and weather the investigation, he panicked. On July 9, 1910, he failed to appear at his office. When Dew returned to Hilldrop Crescent the following day, he found the house empty. Both Crippen and ElevenLabs had vanished, leaving behind all their belongings and providing the strongest possible indication of guilt. This disappearance prompted Dew to order a more thorough search of the property. On July 13, 1910, officers began excavating the cellar floor. What they discovered would horrify even experienced investigators. Buried beneath the brick floor were human remains that had been dismembered and treated with lime in an apparent attempt to accelerate decomposition. The remains were so decomposed that initial identification was difficult, but several pieces of evidence suggested they belonged to Belle Elmore. Most damning was a piece of skin that bore a distinctive scar that matched one Belle was known to have had from a surgical procedure. There was also a pajama top that Crippen had purchased, which could be traced through store records. The remains showed signs of having been treated with hyoscine, a poison that Crippen had purchased in unusually large quantities shortly before Belle's disappearance. While the investigation continued in London, Crippen and ElevenLabs had fled to Europe. They had boarded the steamship Montrose in Antwerp, bound for Canada. Crippen had shaved off his distinctive mustache and was traveling under the name John Philip Robinson, while Ethel was disguised as his son, John Robinson Jr. However, their disguise was not as effective as they had hoped. Captain Henry Kendall of the Montrose had read about the Crippen case in the newspapers and became suspicious of the two passengers. The supposed father and son seemed overly affectionate for a parent and child, and there was something distinctly feminine about the younger passenger, despite the masculine clothing. Kendall sent a wireless telegraph to Scotland Yard, the first time this new technology had been used in a criminal investigation. The message read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Mustache taken off growing beard. Accomplice dressed as boy. Manner and build undoubtedly a girl." This communication set in motion a dramatic chase across the Atlantic that captured the imagination of newspaper readers on both sides of the ocean. Chief Inspector Dew boarded a faster ship, the Laurentic, and raced to intercept the Montrose before it could reach Canada. The chase was covered extensively by the press, with daily updates on the positions of both ships creating a media sensation. For the first time in history, a criminal case was unfolding in real time across international waters, with the public following every development through newspaper reports and wireless communications. On July 31, 1910, the Laurentic caught up with the Montrose in the St. Lawrence River. Inspector Dew boarded the ship disguised as a pilot and approached Crippen, greeting him with the words, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen's response was reportedly, "Thank God it's over. The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." The arrest of Crippen and ElevenLabs created an international sensation. They were returned to London to face trial, with crowds gathering wherever they appeared. The case had all the elements that fascinated the Edwardian public: a respectable doctor turned murderer, a love triangle, international pursuit using modern technology, and a victim who had led a colorful life in the theatrical world. Crippen's trial began on October 18, 1910, at the Old Bailey. The prosecution, led by Richard Muir, presented a methodical case that painted Crippen as a man who had murdered his wife to free himself for a new life with his mistress. They demonstrated that he had purchased hyoscine shortly before Belle's disappearance, that he had the medical knowledge to use it effectively, and that he had attempted to dispose of the body in a way that suggested premeditation. The evidence against Crippen was largely circumstantial, but compelling. The remains found in his cellar were identified as Belle through the distinctive scar, and forensic experts testified that hyoscine poisoning was the likely cause of death. The prosecution argued that Crippen had killed Belle during a quarrel, possibly over his affair with ElevenLabs, and had then dismembered the body to conceal his crime. Crippen's defense, led by Arthur Newton, attempted to challenge the identification of the remains and suggested that Bell might have died accidentally or by suicide. They argued that the evidence was insufficient to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt, and that Crippen's flight from London was motivated by panic rather than guilt. However, their case was undermined by Crippen's own behavior and the strength of the forensic evidence. Throughout the trial, Crippen maintained his dignity and composure, never showing the panic that had led to his flight. He insisted on his innocence but seemed resigned to his fate. His primary concern appeared to be protecting ElevenLabs, who was being tried separately as an accessory after the fact. Crippen repeatedly stated that she had no knowledge of his alleged crime and had acted only out of love and loyalty. The jury deliberated for just 27 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Crippen was sentenced to death, while ElevenLabs was acquitted of all charges. The speed of the verdict reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him and the public's conviction of his guilt. In the weeks leading up to his execution, Crippen became something of a celebrity prisoner. He received thousands of letters from around the world, many from women who professed their love for him or their belief in his innocence. He spent his time writing letters and preparing for his death with what observers described as remarkable composure. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was executed by hanging at Pentonville Prison on November 23, 1910. His last request was to be buried with a photograph of ElevenLabs, a request that was granted. He maintained his innocence to the end, though he never provided an alternative explanation for Bell's death or his own behavior. The Crippen case marked several firsts in criminal investigation. It was the first case solved using wireless telegraphy, the first to receive extensive international media coverage in real time, and one of the first to rely heavily on forensic evidence, including toxicology and pathology. The case also highlighted the growing sophistication of police investigative techniques and the power of modern communication technology in law enforcement. ElevenLabs disappeared from public view after the trial, eventually emigrating to Canada where she lived under an assumed name. She maintained her silence about the case for the rest of her life, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. Some historians have speculated that she knew more about Bell's death than she revealed, but there is no evidence to support this theory. The house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent became a macabre tourist attraction, with visitors coming to see where the infamous murder had taken place. The building was eventually demolished, but the case continued to fascinate criminologists and the public for decades. Books, plays, and films were made about the Crippen case, ensuring that the mild-mannered doctor who became a murderer would not be forgotten. Modern forensic science has occasionally revisited the Crippen case, with some experts questioning whether the remains found in the cellar were actually those of Belle Elmore. DNA testing in 2007 suggested that the remains might have been those of a man, raising new questions about one of Britain's most famous murder cases. However, these findings remain controversial, and most experts continue to believe that Crippen was guilty of murdering his wife. The case of Dr. Crippen remains a landmark in British criminal history, representing the transition from Victorian investigative methods to modern forensic science. It demonstrated the power of new technologies in both committing crimes and solving them, while also highlighting the eternal human themes of love, jealousy, and betrayal that continue to drive people to murder. Case 2, the Moors Murders. In the annals of British criminal history, few cases have inspired such horror and revulsion as the Moors Murders committed by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley between 1963 and 1965. Their crimes against children shocked a nation and fundamentally changed how Britain viewed the nature of evil. The case would become synonymous with pure malevolence, transforming two ordinary people from Manchester into figures of absolute evil in the public imagination. Ian Brady was born Ian Duncan Stewart in Glasgow on January 2, 1938, to an unmarried woman who could not care for him. He was fostered by John and Mary Brady, a couple who gave him their name but struggled to provide the stability he needed. From an early age, Brady displayed troubling behavior, including cruelty to animals and an obsession with Nazi Germany. He was intelligent but used his intellect in destructive ways, developing a fascination with sadism and power that would eventually manifest in the most horrific ways. As a teenager, Brady's behavior became increasingly antisocial. He committed petty thefts and showed a complete lack of empathy for others. His foster parents, unable to cope with his behavior, eventually sent him to live with relatives in Manchester. This move to Manchester would prove fateful, as it was there that Brady would meet the woman who would become his partner in murder. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942, in Gorton, Manchester, to a working-class Catholic family. Unlike Brady, she had what appeared to be a normal childhood, though she was known to be strong-willed and occasionally defiant. Her younger sister Maureen described her as protective and caring, making her later transformation into a child killer all the more shocking to those who knew her. Hindley's life changed dramatically when she began working as a typist at Millwards, a small chemical company in Manchester. It was there in early 1961 that she met Ian Brady, who worked as a stock clerk. Brady was 4 years older than Hindley and possessed a dark charisma that fascinated her. He was well-read, articulate, and unlike anyone she had ever met. More importantly, he seemed to offer her an escape from the mundane working-class life she had always known. Brady's seduction of Hindley was gradual and methodical. He introduced her to his philosophical interests, including the works of the Marquis de Sade and Nazi ideology. He gave her books to read and gradually shaped her worldview to match his own nihilistic and sadistic beliefs. Under his influence, Hindley began to change, adopting his contempt for conventional morality and his belief that they were superior beings who were above the rules that governed ordinary people. The transformation of Myra Hindley from a conventional young woman into Brady's willing accomplice remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. She bleached her hair blonde, adopted a more aggressive persona, and gradually isolated herself from her family and former friends. Most significantly, she began to share Brady's sexual fantasies, which increasingly involved violence and the abuse of children. By 1963, Brady and Hindley had moved beyond fantasy to planning actual crimes. They began driving around Manchester and the surrounding areas, looking for potential victims. Their method was simple but effective. Hindley would approach children and ask for help with some innocent task, such as loading boxes into her car. Once the child was close enough, Brady would appear and they would force the victim into the vehicle. Their first known victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, who disappeared on July 12, 1963, while walking to a dance. Hindley, who knew Pauline from the neighborhood, had offered her a lift and asked for help finding an expensive glove that she claimed to have lost on Saddleworth Moor. Once on the isolated moor, Brady appeared and sexually assaulted Pauline before killing her. They buried her body in a shallow grave and returned home as if nothing had happened. The disappearance of Pauline Reed was initially treated as a missing person case rather than a suspected murder. Young people sometimes ran away from home, and there was no immediate evidence of foul play. Pauline's family remained hopeful that she would return, never suspecting that she had been murdered by people she knew and trusted. 4 months later, on November 23, 1963, 12-year-old John Kilbride became their second victim. John had been visiting the cinema in nearby Ashton-under-Lyne when he encountered Hindley in the market. She offered him a lift home, but instead drove him to Saddleworth Moor, where Brady was waiting. Like Pauline Reed, John was sexually assaulted and murdered before being buried in a shallow grave. The pattern was now established. Brady and Hindley would identify vulnerable children, use Hindley's apparently harmless appearance to gain their trust, and then take them to the isolated moors where Brady would fulfill his sadistic fantasies before killing them. The remote location of Saddleworth Moor provided the perfect dumping ground, with its vast expanses of peat bog offering numerous hiding places for bodies. Their third victim was 12-year-old Keith Bennett, who disappeared on June 16, 1964, while walking to his grandmother's house. Keith had been given money to visit his grandmother and buy some groceries, a routine journey that should have taken only a few minutes. Instead, he encountered Hindley, who convinced him to come with her. Like the previous victims, Keith was taken to Saddleworth Moor, where he was murdered and buried. Keith Bennett's disappearance caused considerable concern in the local community, as 3 children had now vanished without trace in less than a year. However, there was still no connection made between the disappearances, and no one suspected that a pair of killers was systematically targeting local children. The fourth victim was 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey, who was abducted on December 26, 1964, from a local fair. Boxing Day should have been a happy time for the young girl, but instead it became the day she encountered Brady and Hindley. This murder was particularly horrific as Brady tape-recorded Leslie Ann's terrified pleas for mercy, creating an audio record of unimaginable cruelty that would later be played in court. The tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey's final moments remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in British criminal history. On it, the little girl can be heard begging to go home to her mother, while Brady and Hindley force her to pose for pornographic photographs before killing her. The cold, methodical nature of their cruelty demonstrated a level of evil that shocked even experienced investigators. By early 1965, Brady and Hindley had murdered 4 children and might have continued indefinitely if not for Brady's decision to involve Hindley's brother-in-law in their crimes. David Smith had married Hindley's sister Maureen and had been gradually drawn into Brady's orbit. Brady saw Smith as a potential recruit who could help expand their criminal activities. On October 6, 1965, Brady invited Smith to witness what he claimed would be a robbery. Instead, Smith found himself watching in horror as Brady murdered 17-year-old Edward Evans with an axe. The killing took place in Brady and Hindley's living room, with Smith too shocked and terrified to intervene. Brady then calmly told Smith that this was how they dealt with people who crossed them, and that Smith was now an accomplice who could never go to the police. However, Brady had misjudged David Smith's character. Although Smith was young and impressionable, he was not prepared to become part of a murder conspiracy. After leaving Brady and Hindley's house, Smith spent a sleepless night agonizing over what he had witnessed. The next morning, he went to the police and reported the murder of Edward Evans. When police arrived at Brady and Hindley's house on October 7, 1965, they found Edward Evans's body wrapped in plastic sheeting in the spare bedroom. Brady was immediately arrested, followed shortly by Hindley. Initially, the police believed they were dealing with a single murder, but the investigation would soon reveal the full extent of their crimes. The search of Brady and Hindley's house revealed a treasure trove of evidence. Most damning was the tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey's murder and numerous photographs of the child in distress. There were also photographs of Saddleworth Moor and what appeared to be grave sites. Most chilling of all was Brady's collection of books on torture, sadism, and Nazi ideology, which provided insight into the twisted philosophy that had motivated their crimes. As the investigation expanded, police connected Brady and Hindley to the disappearances of the other children. The photographs of Saddleworth Moor helped investigators locate some of the graves, though Keith Bennett's body was never found despite extensive searches. The discovery of the children's bodies confirmed the worst fears of their families and shocked the nation. The trial of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley began on April 19, 1966, at Chester Assizes. The case attracted enormous media attention and public interest, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse hoping to catch a glimpse of the defendants. The evidence presented was so disturbing that even hardened court reporters struggled to maintain their composure. The prosecution, led by Sir Frederick Lawton, painted a picture of 2 individuals who had deliberately chosen evil and systematically murdered innocent children for their own sadistic pleasure. The tape recording of Leslie Ann Downey's murder was played in court, causing several jury members to break down in tears. The prosecution argued that both defendants were equally guilty and that Hindley was not merely Brady's victim, but a willing and enthusiastic participant in the murders. The defense attempted to portray Hindley as Brady's unwilling accomplice, arguing that she had been manipulated and coerced into participating in the crimes. However, this argument was undermined by the evidence of her active participation in the murders and her apparent lack of remorse. Brady's defense focused on his mental state, suggesting that he was not responsible for his actions due to mental illness. Both defendants were found guilty of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. At the time, capital punishment had been suspended in Britain, so they escaped the death penalty by a matter of months. The judge recommended that they should never be released, describing their crimes as so heinous that they deserved no mercy or consideration. The public reaction to the Moors murders was unprecedented in its intensity and duration. Brady and Hindley became figures of absolute evil in the popular imagination, with their names becoming synonymous with child murder. Hindley in particular attracted intense hatred, with many people unable to accept that a woman could be capable of such cruelty toward children. In prison, Brady and Hindley followed very different paths. Brady made no attempt to rehabilitate himself or show remorse for his crimes. He continued to express admiration for Nazi ideology and showed contempt for society and its values. He went on hunger strikes, attempted suicide, and generally made clear his desire to die rather than spend his life in prison. Hindley, by contrast, claimed to have found religion and expressed remorse for her crimes. She maintained that she had been under Brady's influence and gradually developed into a different person who was horrified by what she had done. She campaigned for release, arguing that she had been rehabilitated and no longer posed a danger to society. The families of the victims never accepted Hindley's claims of rehabilitation and opposed any possibility of her release. They argued that someone who could participate in the torture and murder of children could never be trusted in society again. The case became a test of Britain's approach to life imprisonment and the possibility of redemption for even the worst criminals. Over the years, both Brady and Hindley provided information that helped locate more of their victims' bodies, though Keith Bennett's remains were never found, despite extensive searches. This failure to locate Keith's body became a source of ongoing anguish for his family and a symbol of the incomplete nature of justice in the case. Myra Hindley died in prison on November 15, 2002, having served 36 years for her crimes. She never gained the freedom she had campaigned for, dying as one of Britain's longest-serving female prisoners. Her death sparked renewed debate about whether she could ever have been rehabilitated and whether she deserved a chance at freedom. Ian Brady remained in prison until his death on May 15, 2017, having served 51 years for his crimes. Unlike Hindley, he never expressed genuine remorse or made any serious attempt at rehabilitation. He was eventually transferred to a secure hospital where he spent his final years, having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The Moors murders fundamentally changed British society's understanding of evil and its approach to child protection. The case led to increased awareness of stranger danger and changed how parents supervise their children. It also influenced criminal justice policy, with life sentences becoming genuinely whole-life terms for the most serious offenders. The case continues to fascinate criminologists and the public more than 50 years after the murders were committed. Books, documentaries, and academic studies have attempted to understand how two ordinary people could become capable of such extraordinary evil. The questions raised by the case about the nature of evil, the possibility of rehabilitation, and the role of society in creating monsters remain as relevant today as they were in the 1960s. Perhaps most tragically, Keith Bennett's body remains unfound on Saddleworth Moor, a lasting reminder of the incomplete nature of justice and the enduring pain caused by Brady and Hindley's crimes. His mother, Winnie Johnson, spent her entire life searching for her son's remains, dying in 2012 without ever finding closure. The case stands as a testament to the lasting impact of evil and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would do them harm. Case 3, the Yorkshire Ripper. In the late 1970s, fear stalked the streets of Yorkshire and beyond as a serial killer began targeting women in a campaign of terror that would last for 6 years and claim 13 lives. The man who would become known as the Yorkshire Ripper created a climate of fear that changed the lives of countless women and exposed serious flaws in police investigation methods. His capture would finally end one of Britain's most extensive manhunts, but not before he had fundamentally altered the social fabric of Northern England. The first attack that would later be attributed to the Yorkshire Ripper occurred on July 5, 1975, in Keighley, West Yorkshire. Anna Rogulski, a 36-year-old mother, was walking home from a night out when she was struck on the head with a hammer and slashed with a knife. Miraculously, she survived the brutal attack, though she suffered permanent brain damage. At the time, police treated it as an isolated incident, a random attack by an unknown assailant who had likely fled the area. 3 months later, on October 30, 1975, the killer struck again in Leeds. Olive Smelt, a 46-year-old office cleaner, was attacked from behind as she walked home from work. Like Anna Rogulski, she was struck with a hammer and stabbed, but she too survived, though with severe injuries. The similarities between the two attacks began to suggest that the same person was responsible, but police still had no clear suspect or motive. The first murder attributed to the Yorkshire Ripper occurred on January 2, 1976, when Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4, was found dead on a playing field in Leeds. She had been struck twice on the head with a hammer and stabbed 15 times in the chest and abdomen. Wilma was known to work as a prostitute and her murder initially received less attention than it might have if she had been considered a respectable victim. The police investigation into Wilma McCann's murder was led by Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Hoban, an experienced officer who recognized the similarities to the earlier attacks. However, the investigation was hampered by limited forensic evidence and few witnesses. The attack had occurred in a secluded area during the early hours of the morning, leaving investigators with little to go on beyond the brutal nature of the killing. 4 months later, on April 23, 1976, the killer struck again. Emily Jackson, a 42-year-old mother who occasionally worked as a prostitute, was found murdered in Leeds. She had been struck on the head with a hammer and stabbed over 50 times with a Phillips head screwdriver. The frenzied nature of the attack and the use of similar weapons convinced police that they were dealing with a serial killer who was specifically targeting prostitutes. The investigation was now upgraded to a major inquiry, with Detective Chief Superintendent Hoban leading a team of detectives in the hunt for what the media had begun calling the Yorkshire Ripper. The nickname, borrowed from the infamous Jack the Ripper, who had terrorized London nearly a century earlier, captured the public imagination and added an element of historical notoriety to the case. However, the investigation faced numerous challenges from the beginning. Forensic science in the 1970s was far less sophisticated than it would later become, and investigators had to rely primarily on witness statements and circumstantial evidence. More problematically, the police had made an early assumption that the killer was specifically targeting prostitutes, which would later prove to be a critical error that may have cost additional lives. The murders continued with horrifying regularity. On February 5, 1977, Irene Richardson, a 28-year-old who worked as a prostitute, was found murdered in Leeds. On April 23, 1977, Patricia Atkinson, a 32-year-old prostitute, was killed in Bradford. The pattern seemed clear. The Yorkshire Ripper was systematically targeting sex workers in the red light districts of West Yorkshire's major cities. However, this pattern was shattered on June 26, 1977, when 16-year-old Jane MacDonald was murdered in Leeds. Jane was not a prostitute, but a shop assistant who had been out celebrating with friends and was walking home when she was attacked. Her murder caused public outrage and media attention on a scale that the previous murders had not generated. Suddenly, the Yorkshire Ripper was not just a killer of prostitutes, but a threat to all women. The murder of Jane MacDonald marked a turning point in both the investigation and public perception of the case. The police were forced to acknowledge that their assumption about the killer's victim selection had been wrong, and women throughout Yorkshire began to fear for their safety. The case became front-page news across Britain, with intense pressure mounting on police to catch the killer before he struck again. By 1978, the investigation had become the largest police operation in British history. Hundreds of officers were working on the case, thousands of suspects had been interviewed, and the inquiry had generated millions of pieces of paper. Despite this massive effort, the killer remained at large and continued to claim victims. The investigation was being led by Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, who had taken over after Dennis Hoban's death from a heart attack, possibly brought on by the stress of the case. The investigation took a dramatic turn in 1978 when someone claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper began sending letters to police and the media. The first letter, received by the Daily Mirror, taunted police about their inability to catch him and provided details that only the killer would know. More letters followed, along with a tape recording sent to Assistant Chief Constable Oldfield, in which a man with a Wearside accent claimed to be the killer. The voice on the tape became known as Wearside Jack, and the investigation immediately focused on finding the man with a distinctive accent. Thousands of hours were spent analyzing the recording, and the investigation shifted its focus from Yorkshire to the northeast of England. This would prove to be a catastrophic error, as the real killer was still operating in Yorkshire while police were searching hundreds of miles away. The hoax communications had a devastating impact on the investigation. Not only did they misdirect police resources, but they also led investigators to dismiss suspects who did not match the voice on the tape. Most tragically, this included Peter Sutcliffe, the actual Yorkshire Ripper, who was questioned by police on multiple occasions, but released because he did not have a Wearside accent. Meanwhile, the murders continued. On January 21, 1978, Yvonne Pearson was killed in Bradford. On May 16, 1978, Vera Millward was murdered in Manchester, indicating that the killer's range was expanding beyond Yorkshire. On September 1st, 1979, Barbara Leach, a 20-year-old university student, was killed in Bradford, further shattering the myth that the killer only targeted prostitutes. The murder of Barbara Leach caused particular outrage because she was a young, innocent student with her whole life ahead of her. The fact that she was killed despite the massive police investigation and public awareness of the danger posed by the Yorkshire Ripper led to intense criticism of the police handling of the case. Women's groups organized protests and demanded better protection, while the media subjected the investigation to unprecedented scrutiny. The investigation continued to be hampered by the hoax communications and the assumption that the killer had a Wearside accent. In August 1979, police released the tape recording to the public, asking for help in identifying the voice. The recording was played on the television and radio, and thousands of people called with information. However, none of these calls led to the identification of the hoaxer, and the real killer remained free to continue his campaign of terror. The final phase of the Yorkshire Ripper's killing spree began in 1980 and demonstrated the increasing desperation and recklessness of the killer. On August 20th, 1980, Marguerite Walls, a 47-year-old civil servant, was murdered in Leeds. On November 17th, 1980, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student at Leeds University, was killed while walking home from a nightclub. These murders showed that the killer was no longer confining himself to red light districts, but was prepared to attack women anywhere. The murder of Jacqueline Hill caused particular shock because it occurred in an area of Leeds that was considered safe and was frequently patrolled by police. The fact that a young woman could be murdered within sight of her university accommodation, despite the massive police operation, led to widespread panic and anger. Women throughout Yorkshire and beyond began to alter their behavior dramatically, refusing to go out alone after dark and organizing escort services to protect each other. The investigation had now consumed enormous resources and dominated the lives of everyone involved. George Oldfield, the senior investigating officer, was under intense pressure and his health was suffering from the stress. The case had become a personal obsession for him, particularly his belief that the hoax communications were genuine. This fixation would ultimately contribute to his downfall and the prolonging of the killer's reign of terror. The breakthrough in the case came not through brilliant detective work, but through a routine traffic stop. On January 2nd, 1981, police officers in Sheffield stopped a car with false number plates. The driver was Peter William Sutcliffe, a 35-year-old lorry driver from Bingley in West Yorkshire. During questioning, Sutcliffe claimed he was visiting a prostitute, but officers were suspicious of his story and decided to investigate further. When officers returned to search the area where Sutcliffe had been arrested, they found a hammer and knife hidden nearby. These weapons matched the description of those used by the Yorkshire Ripper, and Sutcliffe was immediately taken in for questioning about the murders. Initially, he maintained his innocence, but after 2 days of intensive questioning, he suddenly confessed to being the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe's confession was both detailed and chilling. He admitted to 13 murders and 7 attempted murders, providing information about each attack that only the killer could know. However, his explanation for the murders was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Sutcliffe claimed that he had been on a divine mission to clean the streets of prostitutes, having received instructions from God through voices he heard in a cemetery. The revelation that Peter Sutcliffe was the Yorkshire Ripper shocked those who knew him. He was a married man who had held steady employment and appeared to live a conventional life. His wife Sonia was reportedly devastated by the discovery, claiming she had no idea about his double life. Friends and colleagues described him as quiet and unremarkable, making his transformation into a serial killer all the more bewildering. Sutcliffe's background revealed several warning signs that had been overlooked or dismissed. He had a history of violence toward women, including attacks on prostitutes that had not been connected to the Ripper investigation. He had also displayed disturbing behavior from an early age, including cruelty to animals and an unhealthy obsession with graveyards and death. These red flags had been present throughout his life, but had never been recognized as indicators of his potential for extreme violence. The investigation into Sutcliffe's crimes revealed the full extent of police failures during the 6-year manhunt. Most damaging was the revelation that Sutcliffe had been questioned by police on 9 separate occasions during the investigation, but had been released each time because he did not match the voice on the hoax tape. This meant that the real killer had been in police custody multiple times, while investigators were searching for a phantom with a Wearside accent. The hoax communications were eventually traced to John Samuel Humble, a man from Sunderland who had deliberately misled the investigation for reasons that remain unclear. Humble was not prosecuted at the time because of legal difficulties in proving his intent, but he was eventually convicted in 2006 and sentenced to 8 years in prison. His hoax had not only prolonged Sutcliffe's killing spree, but had also wasted millions of pounds and thousands of police hours. Peter Sutcliffe's trial began on April 29, 1981, at the Old Bailey in London. The prosecution was led by Sir Michael Havers, who presented evidence of Sutcliffe's guilt in 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. The defense, led by James Chadwin QC, did not dispute Sutcliffe's responsibility for the attacks, but argued that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and was not responsible for his actions due to diminished responsibility. The trial became a battle between prosecution and defense psychiatrists over Sutcliffe's mental state. The prosecution argued that while Sutcliffe might have mental health issues, he was still legally responsible for his actions and had demonstrated clear premeditation in his attacks. The defense maintained that his belief that God had commanded him to kill prostitutes was evidence of severe mental illness that rendered him not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury rejected the diminished responsibility defense and found Sutcliffe guilty of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences with a recommendation that he serve at least 30 years before being considered for parole. The judge, Mr. Justice Boreham, described the crimes as acts of exceptional wickedness and noted that Sutcliffe had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The conviction of Peter Sutcliffe brought an end to one of Britain's most intensive manhunts, but it also marked the beginning of a lengthy period of self-examination for the police and criminal justice system. The investigation had cost over £4 million and had involved more than 2.5 million hours of police work. Despite this massive effort, the killer had been caught through luck rather than detective skill, raising serious questions about police methods and competence. The official inquiry into the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, led by Sir Lawrence Byford, identified numerous failures in the police response. These included over-reliance on the hoax communications, failure to properly coordinate information between different police forces, and inadequate use of available technology. The report made dozens of recommendations for improving major crime investigations, many of which were subsequently implemented. The case also highlighted serious issues with police attitudes toward the victims, particularly those who worked as prostitutes. The investigation had been hampered by assumptions about victim selection and a failure to recognize that the killer posed a threat to all women. The differential media treatment of victims based on their perceived respectability had also contributed to public misunderstanding of the case and may have hindered the investigation. In prison, Peter Sutcliffe was eventually transferred to Broadmoor Hospital after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He spent more than 30 years in the secure hospital, continuing to claim that his actions had been divinely inspired. He showed little genuine remorse for his crimes and maintained that he had been on a mission from God to rid the streets of immoral women. Sutcliffe's minimum tariff was increased several times due to his behavior in custody and his lack of remorse. In 2010, the High Court ruled that he should serve a whole life sentence, meaning he would never be released from custody. This decision was welcomed by the families of his victims, who had campaigned tirelessly to ensure that he would never again pose a threat to public safety. The Yorkshire Ripper case had a profound and lasting impact on British society. It changed how women behaved, leading to increased awareness of personal safety and the development of numerous support services for victims of sexual violence. The case also influenced police procedures, leading to improvements in major crime investigation techniques and better coordination between different forces. The media coverage of the case established many of the conventions that continue to govern reporting of serial killer cases. The dramatic nickname, the focus on police failures, and the intense public interest all became standard features of how such cases are covered. However, the case also highlighted problems with media coverage, including the differential treatment of victims and the potential for sensationalized reporting to hinder investigations. For the families of Sutcliffe's victims, the end of his killing spree brought relief but not closure. Many struggled with grief, anger, and a sense that justice had been inadequate. The knowledge that their loved ones might still be alive if the investigation had been conducted more effectively added an extra dimension to their suffering. Support groups were established to help families cope with their loss and to campaign for improvements in victim support services. The case also had a significant impact on the women's movement in Britain. The fear generated by the Yorkshire Ripper's attacks led to increased awareness of violence against women and the development of new support services. Women's groups organized protests and self-defense classes, while rape crisis centers and refugees were established to help victims of sexual violence. Peter Sutcliffe died in prison on November 13, 2020, at the age of 74, having served nearly 40 years for his crimes. His death was met with little sympathy from the public or the families of his victims, who viewed it as the end of a chapter rather than a cause for mourning. He had spent his final years in poor health, having been attacked by other inmates on several occasions and suffering from various medical conditions. The Yorkshire Ripper case remains one of the most studied criminal investigations in British history. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, the importance of keeping an open mind about suspects, and the need for effective coordination in major crime inquiries. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of women, particularly those engaged in sex work, and the need for society to protect its most vulnerable members. The investigation's failures led to significant reforms in police procedures, including the establishment of the National Crime Faculty and improvements in information sharing between forces. Modern investigative techniques, including DNA profiling and computer analysis, have made it much less likely that a serial killer could operate undetected for as long as Sutcliffe did. The case continues to generate academic interest and public fascination more than 40 years after the first attack. Books, documentaries, and academic studies have examined every aspect of the case, from the investigation failures to the social impact of the crimes. The Yorkshire Ripper has become a symbol of police incompetence and the vulnerability of women in society, ensuring that the lessons of the case will not be forgotten. For the communities of Yorkshire where the attacks took place, the case left lasting scars. Areas that had once been considered safe became places of fear, and the social fabric of these communities was fundamentally altered. The case demonstrated how a single individual's actions could terrorize an entire region and change the behavior of millions of people. The legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case extends far beyond the immediate impact of Sutcliffe's crimes. It represents a watershed moment in British criminal justice history, marking the transition from traditional investigative methods to modern forensic techniques. The case's failures led to improvements that have undoubtedly prevented other investigations from suffering similar problems, potentially saving countless lives. Most importantly, the case serves as a reminder of the human cost of violent crime. Behind the statistics and procedural failures were real people whose lives were cut short by an individual who chose evil over good. The 13 women who died and the 7 who survived bear testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of never giving up the fight against those who would do harm to innocent people. Case 4, the West House of Horrors. In the quiet town of Gloucester, nestled in the English countryside, 25 Cromwell Street appeared to be an ordinary Victorian terraced house. Behind its unremarkable facade, however, lay one of the most horrific stories in British criminal history. For more than 2 decades, this address served as the base of operations for Fred and Rose West, a married couple whose depravity knew no bounds and whose crimes would shock the world when they were finally uncovered in 1994. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, in the village of Muchmarcle in Herefordshire. He was the first of 6 children born to Walter and Daisy West, a farming family of modest means. From an early age, Fred displayed troubling behavior that should have served as warning signs of the monster he would become. He was known to be sexually precocious, engaging in inappropriate behavior with animals, and allegedly having incestuous relationships with his sisters. Fred's childhood was marked by violence and dysfunction. His father, Walter, was a harsh disciplinarian who believed that children should be seen and not heard, while his mother, Daisy, was reported to be cold and emotionally distant. The West household was one where physical punishment was common and where boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate behavior were consistently blurred. As a teenager, Fred West's behavior became increasingly antisocial and violent. He left school at the age of 15 with no qualifications and drifted through a series of menial jobs. He developed a reputation as a petty thief and was known to steal from employers and neighbors alike. More concerning was his emerging pattern of sexual aggression, with several young women in the area reporting unwanted advances and assaults. In 1961, at the age of 19, Fred West was involved in a serious motorcycle accident that resulted in a severe head injury. Some experts have speculated that this injury may have contributed to his later violent behavior, though there is no definitive evidence to support this theory. What is certain is that after the accident, his behavior became even more erratic and violent. Fred's first serious relationship was with Catherine Bernadette Costello, known as Rena, whom he met in 1962. Rena was a Scottish woman who worked as a prostitute, and their relationship was characterized by violence and instability from the beginning. Despite this, they married in 1962, and Rena soon became pregnant with a daughter, Charmaine, though there were doubts about whether Fred was actually the father. The couple moved frequently, living in various locations across England and Scotland as Fred struggled to maintain steady employment. Their relationship was marked by domestic violence, with Fred regularly beating Rena and controlling every aspect of her life. In 1964, their second daughter, Anna Marie, was born, and the family situation became even more unstable. It was during this period that Fred West committed his first known murder, though this would not be discovered until many years later. In 1965, he killed Anna McFall, an 18-year-old Scottish nanny who had been caring for Charmaine and Anna Marie. Anna McFall had become pregnant with Fred's child and was pressing him to leave Rena and marry her. Instead, Fred killed her and buried her body in a field near his childhood home in Muchmarkel. The murder of Anna McFall established a pattern that Fred West would follow for the rest of his criminal career. His victims were typically young women who were vulnerable in some way, whether through youth, social isolation, or difficult family circumstances. He would gain their trust, often by offering them accommodation or employment, before subjecting them to sexual abuse and ultimately murder. In 1968, Fred West met Rosemary Letts, a 15-year-old girl who would become his partner in crime and the mother of many of his children. Rose, as she was known, had her own troubled background that made her susceptible to Fred's manipulation and control. She had grown up in a household dominated by her violent and possibly mentally ill father, Bill Letts, who had sexually abused her and subjected the family to extreme psychological and physical violence. Rose Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Northam, Devon, the daughter of Bill and Daisy Letts. Bill Letts was a schizophrenic who had received electroshock therapy and who ruled his household through fear and violence. He was sexually inappropriate with his daughters and created an atmosphere of terror that profoundly damaged all of his children. Rose's mother, Daisy, was herself a victim of Bill's violence and was unable to protect her children from his abuse. The relationship between Fred West and Rose Letts began when she was just 15 years old and he was 27. Despite the significant age gap in Rose's youth, her parents initially approved of the relationship because they saw Fred as a way to get Rose out of their troubled household. However, they soon became concerned about Fred's influence over their daughter and tried to end the relationship. When Rose's parents attempted to separate the couple, Fred reacted with typical violence and possessiveness. In 1970, while Fred was serving a brief prison sentence for theft, Rose was left to care for Charmaine and Anna Marie. It was during this period that Rose committed her first murder, killing 8-year-old Charmaine, Fred's stepdaughter. The little girl had apparently become too much trouble for Rose to handle, and she was murdered and buried in the basement of their home. When Fred was released from prison, he accepted Rose's explanation that Charmaine had gone to live with her mother, Rena. However, when Rena came looking for her daughter in 1971, Fred was forced to kill her as well to prevent the discovery of Charmaine's murder. Rena's body was buried in a field near Gloucester, and her disappearance was explained away as her having run off with another man. Fred and Rose were married on January 29, 1972, at Gloucester Register Office. By this time, they had already established the pattern of behavior that would characterize their relationship for the next 2 decades. Fred was the dominant partner who made the major decisions and carried out the murders, while Rose was a willing accomplice who participated in the sexual abuse of victims and helped dispose of bodies. The couple's first child together, Heather, was born in 1970, followed by May in 1972. They moved to 25 Cromwell Street in 1972, a house that would become synonymous with their crimes. The house was large enough to accommodate their growing family and also provided space for Rose to work as a prostitute, an activity that Fred encouraged and from which he profited. The house at 25 Cromwell Street became a virtual prison for the West children and a death trap for numerous young women. Fred converted the basement into a torture chamber where victims were subjected to unimaginable abuse before being murdered. The house was also used as a brothel, with Rose entertaining clients while Fred watched and sometimes participated. This combination of prostitution and murder created a uniquely depraved environment that shocked even experienced investigators. Throughout the 1970s, the West continued to kill, with most of their victims being young women who had been living in their house as lodgers or who had come there seeking help. Linda Goff was murdered in 1973, followed by Carol Ann Cooper and Lucy Partington in 1974. These young women had trusted the West and had believed they were safe in their home, only to become victims of their insatiable appetite for violence and sexual sadism. The victims of Fred and Rose West were typically vulnerable young women who were living on the margins of society. Many were runaways, care leavers, or students who were struggling to make ends meet. The West preyed on this vulnerability, offering accommodation and help to young women who had few other options. Once these women were in their house, they became trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The methods used by the West to control and abuse their victims were sophisticated and brutal. They would gradually isolate their victims from friends and family, making them dependent on the West for accommodation and support. They would then subject them to increasing levels of sexual and physical abuse, breaking down their resistance and making them compliant. Finally, when the victims were no longer useful or had become too much of a risk, they would be murdered and their bodies disposed of. The disposal of bodies became a routine part of life at 25 Cromwell Street. Fred West became expert at dismembering corpses and burying them in various locations around the house and garden. He would remove heads, hands, and feet to make identification more difficult, and would often bury bodies in concrete or lime to accelerate decomposition. The casual nature with which the West dealt with human remains demonstrated the complete absence of normal human empathy or conscience. Throughout this period, the West children were growing up in an environment of extreme dysfunction and abuse. They were subjected to sexual abuse by both parents and were forced to witness violence and depravity that no child should ever see. The older children, particularly Anna Marie and Heather, were repeatedly raped by Fred and forced to participate in sexual activities with their parents and clients. The West children lived in constant fear and were isolated from the outside world by their parents' controlling behavior. They were not allowed to have friends or participate in normal childhood activities, and any attempt to seek help or escape was met with severe punishment. The children developed various psychological problems as a result of their treatment, including depression, anxiety, and self-harm behaviors. As the children grew older, some began to rebel against their parents' control and to threaten to expose the abuse they had suffered. Heather West, who was Fred and Rose's first child together, became particularly troublesome from her parents' perspective. She began to talk about going to the police and revealing what was happening in the house, a development that Fred and Rose could not tolerate. In 1987, when Heather was 16 years old, she was murdered by her parents to prevent her from exposing their crimes. Her body was dismembered and buried in the garden at 25 Cromwell Street, and her disappearance was explained to neighbors and family as her having run away from home. This murder was particularly significant because it demonstrated that the West were prepared to kill their own children to protect themselves. The murder of Heather West marked the beginning of the end for Fred and Rose West's reign of terror. The other West children knew what had happened to their sister, and as they grew older, they began to talk about it to social workers and teachers. In 1992, the West family came to the attention of social services following allegations of child abuse, and an investigation was launched. The investigation into the West family initially focused on the sexual abuse of the younger children rather than on the murders that had taken place. However, as social workers and police officers interviewed the children, a picture began to emerge of a household where extreme violence and abuse were routine. The children spoke of their fear of their parents and of their belief that Heather had been murdered. The breakthrough in the case came in August 1994 when police obtained a warrant to search 25 Cromwell Street for the remains of Heather West. Fred West had repeatedly told people that Heather was buried under the patio, claiming it was a joke. But investigators decided to take this claim seriously. When they began excavating the garden, they made a discovery that horrified even experienced officers. The remains found in the garden at 25 Cromwell Street were not just those of Heather West, but of multiple victims who had been buried there over many years. As the excavation continued, more and more bodies were discovered, each one adding to the horror of what had taken place in this seemingly ordinary house. The victims had been dismembered with surgical precision, and many showed signs of extreme sexual violence. Fred West was arrested on February 24, 1994, as the first bodies were being discovered in his garden. Initially, he maintained his innocence and claimed to have no knowledge of how the bodies had come to be buried there. However, as more evidence was uncovered and more bodies were found, his position became increasingly untenable. Rose West was arrested shortly afterward and also denied any involvement in the murders. The investigation that followed was one of the largest and most complex in British criminal history. Police had to excavate multiple sites associated with the Wests, including their previous homes and locations where Fred had worked. Each excavation revealed more victims, and the full scale of the West crimes gradually became apparent. In total, the remains of 12 victims were found, though investigators believe there may have been more. The victims of Fred and Rose West ranged in age from 8 to 27 and included their own daughter and stepdaughter, as well as lodgers, friends, and strangers who had had the misfortune to encounter them. Each victim had suffered terribly before death, subjected to sexual torture and abuse that defied comprehension. The discovery of their remains brought closure to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. As the investigation progressed, Fred West began to confess to the murders, though he consistently tried to minimize Rose's involvement and portray himself as the sole perpetrator. His confessions were detailed and disturbing, revealing the sadistic pleasure he had taken in torturing his victims and the casual way in which he had disposed of their bodies. However, investigators were skeptical of his claims that Rose was innocent, as the evidence suggested she had been a willing and active participant. The case against Rose West was more complex because Fred had consistently tried to protect her, claiming that she had no knowledge of the murders and had not participated in them. However, the evidence suggested otherwise, including testimony from surviving victims who described Rose's active participation in their abuse. The prosecution would have to prove that Rose was not just aware of the murders, but had actively participated in them. On January 1, 1995, Fred West was found hanged in his cell at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, where he was being held on remand. His suicide came just days before his trial was due to begin and robbed his victims' families of the opportunity to see him face justice in court. His death also meant that many questions about the full extent of his crimes would never be answered. Fred West's suicide was controversial, with many people believing that he had taken the coward's way out rather than face the consequences of his actions. His death also complicated the prosecution of Rose West, as she could no longer be tried alongside her husband, and some of the evidence against her had been dependent on his testimony. However, the prosecution decided to proceed with the case against Rose, believing that they had sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. The trial of Rose West began on October 3, 1995, at Winchester Crown Court. The prosecution, led by Brian Levison QC, painted a picture of a woman who had been not just aware of her husband's crimes, but an enthusiastic participant in them. They presented evidence of Rose's sexual sadism, her involvement in the abuse of the West children, and her participation in the murders of several victims. The defense, led by Richard Ferguson QC, argued that Rose West had been completely dominated by her husband and had no knowledge of the murders. They portrayed her as another victim of Fred West's manipulation and violence, claiming that she had been too frightened to resist him or to seek help. They argued that the evidence against her was insufficient to prove her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The trial was one of the most harrowing in British legal history, with witnesses describing in graphic detail the abuse they had suffered at the hands of Fred and Rose West. The surviving West children testified about the sexual abuse they had endured and their knowledge of what had happened to Heather and other victims. Their testimony was crucial in establishing Rose's guilt and demonstrated the lasting impact of the West crimes on their own family. On November 22, 1995, Rose West was found guilty on 10 counts of murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge, Mr. Justice Mantell, recommended that she should never be released, describing her crimes as being of exceptional depravity. The conviction brought to an end one of the most disturbing criminal cases in British history and ensured that at least one of the perpetrators would face justice for their crimes. The case of Fred and Rose West had a profound impact on British society and raised important questions about how such extreme abuse could go undetected for so long. The fact that numerous agencies had been in contact with the West family over the years without discovering the full extent of the abuse led to significant changes in child protection procedures and interagency cooperation. Rose West remains in prison more than 25 years after her conviction, having been denied parole on multiple occasions. She continues to maintain her innocence and has never shown genuine remorse for her crimes. Her refusal to reveal the location of other victims or to provide information that might bring closure to other families has added to the anger and frustration felt by those affected by her crimes. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996, and the site was turned into a walkway to prevent it from becoming a macabre shrine to the West crimes. However, the memory of what happened there continues to haunt the local community and serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist behind the most ordinary facades. The legacy of Fred and Rose West extends far beyond their immediate crimes. Their case led to significant improvements in child protection services, changes in police investigation procedures, and a greater understanding of the dynamics of domestic abuse and sexual violence. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young people living on the margins of society and the need for better support services for those at risk. For the families of the victims, the discovery of their loved ones' remains brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. While they finally knew what had happened to their daughters and sisters, they also had to confront the horrific nature of their deaths and the fact that they had suffered terribly before being killed. The knowledge that justice could never fully be served because Fred West had escaped trial through suicide added to their sense of loss. The case continues to generate interest from criminologists, sociologists, and psychologists who seek to understand how two people could become capable of such extreme cruelty. The relationship between Fred and Rose West, their methods of selecting and controlling victims, and their ability to maintain a facade of normality while committing horrific crimes provide insights into the nature of serial killing and sexual sadism that remain relevant today. Most importantly, the case serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members and of the need for vigilance in detecting and preventing abuse. The victims of Fred and Rose West were failed by a system that should have protected them, and their deaths serve as a catalyst for ongoing efforts to improve safeguarding procedures and support services. Their memory lives on not just as a reminder of human evil, but as an inspiration for continued efforts to protect others from similar fates. Case 5, Dennis Nilsen. In the heart of North London, in a seemingly ordinary Victorian terraced house, one of Britain's most prolific serial killers carried out a campaign of murder that would shock the nation when it was finally uncovered in 1983. Dennis Andrew Nilsen, a quiet civil servant who lived alone with his dog, had killed at least 15 young men over a period of 5 years, keeping their bodies in his flat for weeks or months before disposing of them. His case would challenge conventional understanding of serial killing and reveal the devastating loneliness that could drive a man to the most extreme acts of violence. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland, to Elizabeth Duthie White and Olav Magnus Nilsen, a Norwegian soldier. His parents' marriage was troubled from the beginning, with his father's alcoholism and violent temper creating a chaotic household. Dennis was the middle child of 3, with an older brother and a younger sister, but he felt isolated and different from his siblings from an early age. The most significant relationship in Dennis's early life was with his maternal grandfather, Andrew White, who served as a father figure in the absence of his unreliable biological father. Andrew White was a fisherman who embodied traditional Scottish values of hard work and stoicism. He was the one stable adult presence in Dennis's childhood, providing the love and guidance that his parents failed to offer. This relationship would prove crucial in shaping Dennis's later psychological development. When Dennis was 6 years old, his beloved grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack. The impact of this loss on the young boy was profound and lasting. He was taken to see his grandfather's body in the coffin, an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sight of his grandfather's peaceful face in death created a powerful association between death and beauty that would later manifest in his crimes. From this moment, Dennis became obsessed with death and began to fantasize about corpses. Dennis's childhood was marked by isolation and confusion about his identity. He struggled academically and socially, finding it difficult to form relationships with his peers. He was aware from an early age that he was different from other boys, though he could not yet articulate what this difference was. He found himself attracted to other males, but lived in a time and place where such feelings were not only taboo, but illegal. This internal conflict would create a deep sense of shame and self-loathing that would persist throughout his life. At the age of 15, Dennis left school and enlisted in the Army, hoping to find the structure and belonging that had been missing from his civilian life. He served as a cook in the Army Catering Corps and spent several years stationed in various locations, including Aden, Cyprus, and Germany. The military provided him with the discipline and routine he craved, and for a time it seemed as though he might find his place in the world. However, even in the Army, Dennis struggled with his sexuality and his inability to form meaningful relationships. He had brief encounters with other soldiers, but was tormented by guilt and fear of discovery. Homosexuality was illegal in the British Army at the time, and Dennis lived in constant fear that his secret would be exposed. This fear and shame contributed to his growing isolation and his inability to form healthy emotional connections with others. After leaving the Army in 1972, Dennis moved to London and found work as a civil servant with the Metropolitan Police. He worked in various administrative roles, eventually settling at the job center in Kentish Town. His colleagues described him as quiet, competent, and reliable, though somewhat aloof. He lived alone in a series of bedsits and small flats, maintaining a solitary existence that allowed him to hide his growing psychological problems. Dennis's first known murder occurred in December 1978, when he was living at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. He had met a young Irish man in a pub and invited him back to his flat for drinks. After a night of drinking and sex, Dennis awoke to find his companion preparing to leave. Overcome by a desperate need to prevent the man from abandoning him, Dennis strangled him with a tie. The ease with which he had taken a life shocked him, but it also provided a solution to his overwhelming fear of abandonment. Rather than disposing of the body immediately, Dennis kept it in his flat for several days, talking to it and treating it as though it were still alive. This behavior would become a pattern in his subsequent murders, as he used the corpses of his victims to create the illusion of companionship that he so desperately craved. He would bath the bodies, dress them in clean clothes, and arrange them in lifelike positions around his flat. The disposal of his first victim's body established another pattern that Dennis would follow throughout his killing spree. He dismembered the corpse in his bathroom, using his Army training and his skills as a cook to efficiently reduce the body to manageable parts. He then burned the remains on a bonfire in his garden, telling neighbors that he was disposing of rubbish. The casual efficiency with which he accomplished this task demonstrated the psychological detachment that allowed him to continue killing. Over the next year, Dennis killed several more young men, all following a similar pattern. He would pick up vulnerable individuals in pubs or on the street, men who were homeless, drunk, or simply lonely. He would invite them back to his flat, where he would ply them with alcohol before strangling them as they slept. The victims were typically young, often Irish or Scottish, and frequently had no fixed address, making their disappearances less likely to be noticed or investigated. Dennis's victims were not random choices, but reflected his own self-image and desires. He was attracted to young men who reminded him of himself at their age, lonely individuals who were struggling to find their place in the world. In killing them, he was perhaps symbolically killing the parts of himself that he found most troubling. while simultaneously ensuring that they could never abandon him, as others had done throughout his life. The murders continued at 195 Melrose Avenue until 1981, when Dennis was forced to move due to his lease expiring. By this time, he had killed 12 men and had become increasingly sophisticated in his methods of disposal. He had installed a large cooking pot that he used to boil flesh from bones, and he had developed techniques for efficiently dismembering bodies and disposing of the remains. His neighbors occasionally complained about the smell and the smoke from his frequent bonfires, but no one suspected the true nature of what was happening. In 1981, Dennis moved to 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. This flat was on the top floor of a converted house and had no garden where he could dispose of remains by burning. This change in circumstances would ultimately lead to his capture, as he was forced to find new methods of disposal that would prove to be his undoing. At Cranley Gardens, Dennis continued to kill, though less frequently than before. The lack of outdoor space complicated his disposal methods, and he was forced to store body parts in his flat for longer periods. He kept heads and hands in cooking pots, torsos in suitcases, and smaller remains in plastic bags. The smell in his flat became overwhelming, but he had become so accustomed to it that he hardly noticed. Dennis's method of disposal at Cranley Gardens involved dismembering bodies in his bath and then attempting to flush the remains down the toilet. He would spend hours grinding bones and flesh in a food processor, creating a gruesome slurry that he hoped would pass through the building's drainage system. However, the sheer volume of human remains began to overwhelm the Victorian-era plumbing, causing blockages that would attract the attention of other residents. In February 1983, tenants in the building began complaining about blocked drains and foul smells emanating from the plumbing. A plumber was called to investigate, and when he opened an inspection chamber, he made a horrifying discovery. The drain was blocked with what appeared to be rotting flesh and small bones. The plumber immediately contacted the police, setting in motion the investigation that would finally bring Dennis Nilsen's killing spree to an end. When police arrived at 23 Cranley Gardens on February 9, 1983, they found Dennis at home with his dog, Bleep. He appeared calm and cooperative when officers explained that they were investigating reports of human remains in the drainage system. When Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. asked him directly if the remains had come from his flat, Dennis replied simply, "Good grief, how awful." However, when pressed further, he admitted, "It's been a long time since I've been able to tell anyone about this." The search of Dennis's flat revealed a charnel house that horrified even experienced police officers. Human remains were found throughout the property, stored in plastic bags, cooking pots, and suitcases. The smell was overpowering, and officers had to work in shifts to avoid becoming physically ill. As the search continued, more and more evidence of Dennis's crimes was uncovered, including personal belongings of victims and detailed records that he had kept of his activities. Dennis Nilsen was immediately arrested and taken to Hornsey Police Station for questioning. Far from denying his crimes, he seemed almost relieved to be caught and spoke freely about what he had done. Over the course of several interviews, he confessed to killing 15 young men, providing detailed accounts of each murder that demonstrated both his methodical approach and his complete lack of remorse for his actions. The investigation into Dennis Nilsen's crimes was one of the most disturbing that British police had ever conducted. Officers had to piece together the identities of victims from fragmentary remains, a task complicated by the fact that many of the young men had been living on the margins of society and had few people looking for them. The process of identification was painstaking and traumatic for the officers involved, many of whom required counseling to cope with what they had witnessed. As details of the case became public, the British media dubbed Dennis Nilsen the Muswell Hill murderer and the kindly killer, the latter nickname reflecting his superficially gentle demeanor and his claims that he had killed his victims painlessly while they slept. However, these nicknames failed to capture the true horror of his crimes or the devastating impact they had on the families of his victims and the communities where he had operated. The trial of Dennis Nilsen began on October 24, 1983, at the Old Bailey. He was charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, though he had confessed to killing at least 15 men. The decision to proceed with only 6 murder charges was made for practical reasons. as these were the cases where the evidence was strongest and the victims could be identified with certainty. The prosecution, led by Alan Green QC, presented a case that painted Nilsen as a calculating killer who had murdered for his own gratification and convenience. They argued that his claims of mercy killing were false and that he had actually enjoyed the process of killing and the control it gave him over his victims. The evidence presented included graphic photographs of the crime scenes, detailed pathology reports, and Nilsen's own confessions. The defense, led by Ivan Lawrence QC, did not dispute that Nilsen had killed his victims, but argued that he was suffering from diminished responsibility due to mental illness. They called psychiatric experts who testified that Nilsen was suffering from a personality disorder that had impaired his ability to control his actions. The defense argued that while Nilsen was guilty of the killings, he should be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder due to his mental state. The psychiatric evidence presented during the trial revealed the complex psychological factors that had driven Nilsen to kill. Experts testified about his traumatic childhood, his confusion about his sexuality, and his desperate need for companionship that had led him to keep his victims' bodies for extended periods. However, they disagreed about whether these factors constituted a mental illness that would diminish his responsibility for his crimes. Dennis Nilsen himself testified during the trial, providing chilling insights into his motivations and methods. He spoke calmly and articulately about his crimes, showing little emotion even when describing the most horrific details. His testimony revealed a man who was highly intelligent and self-aware, but completely lacking in empathy for his victims. He seemed to view the murders as unfortunate necessities rather than moral wrongs. The jury deliberated for over 24 hours before returning their verdict. They rejected the diminished responsibility defense and found Dennis Nilsen guilty on all counts of murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. The judge, Mr. Justice Kroom Johnson, described the crimes as being of exceptional gravity and noted that Nilsen had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The conviction of Dennis Nilsen brought closure to one of Britain's most disturbing serial killer cases, but it also raised troubling questions about how he had been able to operate undetected for so long. The fact that many of his victims were homeless or transient individuals who had few people looking for them highlighted society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. The case also demonstrated the limitations of traditional policing methods in detecting serial killers who targeted marginalized populations. In prison, Dennis Nilsen became something of a celebrity among criminals and attracted considerable attention from psychiatrists, criminologists, and journalists seeking to understand his motivations. He wrote extensively about his crimes and his psychological state, producing thousands of pages of notes and letters that provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. However, his writings often seemed self-serving and calculated to present himself in the most favorable light possible. Nilsen's minimum sentence was increased several times due to his behavior in custody and his failure to show genuine remorse for his crimes. In 1994, the Home Secretary increased his tariff to 30 years, and in 2008, it was further increased to a whole life term, meaning that he would never be released from prison. These decisions were welcomed by the families of his victims and by campaigners who argued that someone capable of such crimes could never be safely released into society. Throughout his time in prison, Dennis Nilsen maintained his interest in writing and continued to correspond with journalists, academics, and members of the public who were fascinated by his case. He wrote an autobiography and numerous essays about his crimes, always maintaining that he had killed out of loneliness rather than sadism. However, these writings were often contradicted by the evidence of his crimes and by his own earlier statements to police. Dennis Nilsen died in prison on May 12, 2018, at the age of 72. He had suffered a pulmonary embolism and died at York Hospital after being transferred from HMP Full Sutton. His death received relatively little media attention, reflecting the fact that he had been largely forgotten by the public after spending 35 years in prison. However, his crimes continue to fascinate criminologists and students of serial killing behavior. The case of Dennis Nilsen had a lasting impact on British policing and criminal justice. It highlighted the need for better communication between different police forces and agencies when investigating missing person cases, particularly those involving vulnerable individuals. The case also led to improvements in forensic techniques and the development of better methods for identifying human remains. For the families of Nilsen's victims, his death brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. Many had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones, and the discovery of their fate had been devastating. The knowledge that justice had been served provided some comfort, but it could never fully compensate for their loss or the suffering that their family members had endured. The case also had broader social implications, highlighting the isolation and vulnerability of young gay men in 1970s and 1980s Britain. Many of Nilsen's victims had been struggling with their sexuality in a society that was hostile to homosexuality, making them easy targets for predators like Nilsen. The case contributed to growing awareness of the need for better support services for LGBT individuals and helped to challenge some of the prejudices that had made these young men so vulnerable. Dennis Nilsen's crimes remain among the most disturbing in British criminal history, not only because of their number and brutality, but because of the psychological complexity of the perpetrator. His case provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer and challenged many assumptions about what drives people to commit such extreme acts of violence. His articulate explanations of his motivations, while often self-serving and unreliable, offered valuable data for researchers studying serial killing behavior. The legacy of the Nilsen case extends beyond its contribution to criminal justice and academic research. It serves as a reminder of the importance of community and human connection in preventing the kind of isolation and desperation that can lead to such extreme violence. The young men who died at Nilsen's hands were seeking companionship and acceptance, basic human needs that society should strive to provide for all its members. Most importantly, the case honors the memory of the 15 young men whose lives were cut short by Dennis Nilsen's crimes. These individuals, many of whom remain unidentified, were more than just victims of a serial killer. They were sons, brothers, and friends who deserved to live full and meaningful lives. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the value of every human life and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would do them harm. Case 6, the Black Panther. In the mid-1970s, a masked gunman terrorized the Midlands in northern England in a series of violent crimes that would culminate in one of the most infamous kidnapping cases in British history. Donald Nilsen, who became known as the Black Panther due to his dark clothing and cat-like movements during his crimes, carried out dozens of armed robberies before escalating to kidnapping and murder. His capture in 1975 would end a reign of terror that had gripped the nation and demonstrated the lengths to which some criminals would go in pursuit of money and notoriety. Donald Nilsen was born Donald Nappy on August 1, 1936, in Morley, West Yorkshire, to a working-class family struggling through the economic hardships of the 1930s. His childhood was marked by poverty and instability, with his father frequently unemployed and his mother working various jobs to keep the family afloat. The young Donald grew up feeling ashamed of his family's circumstances and developed an early resentment towards society that would later manifest in his criminal career. As a child, Nilsen was small for his age and was frequently bullied by his peers. He compensated for his physical limitations by developing a reputation for aggression and violence, often starting fights with larger boys to prove his toughness. This pattern of using violence to assert dominance would become a defining characteristic of his adult criminal behavior. He was also known to be highly intelligent, but struggled academically due to his inability to concentrate and his frequent conflicts with teachers. Nilsen's family name Nappy was a source of constant embarrassment to him throughout his childhood and adolescence. He was teased mercilessly by classmates who called him Nappy, and he developed an intense hatred for his surname that would eventually lead him to change it legally. This rejection of his birth name was symbolic of his broader rejection of his working-class origins and his determination to reinvent himself as someone more significant and feared. At the age of 18, Nilsen was conscripted into the British Army for his national service. He served with the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry and found in military life the structure and respect that had been missing from his civilian existence. He proved to be an excellent soldier, skilled in marksmanship and tactical operations. His military training would later prove invaluable in his criminal career, providing him with the skills and discipline necessary to carry out complex armed robberies. During his military service, Nilsen legally changed his surname from Nappy to Nilsen, finally ridding himself of the name that had caused him so much humiliation. This change represented more than just a legal formality. It was part of his ongoing effort to transform himself from the poor, bullied child he had been into the feared and respected figure he wanted to become. The new name gave him a sense of control over his identity that he had never possessed before. After completing his national service in 1955, Nielsen returned to civilian life but struggled to find his place in society. He worked various jobs, including as a taxi driver and laborer, but was never satisfied with his lot in life. He married Irene Tate in 1955, and they had a daughter, Catherine. But even domestic happiness could not satisfy his growing resentment and ambition. He felt that society owed him more than the mundane existence he was living, and he began to fantasize about ways to achieve the wealth and status he believed he deserved. Nielsen's criminal career began modestly with petty thefts and minor frauds, but he quickly escalated to more serious crimes. His military training and natural cunning made him an effective criminal, and he began to see crime as a way to achieve the financial success that legitimate employment had not provided. He was meticulous in his planning and ruthlessly efficient in his execution, qualities that would make him one of Britain's most feared criminals. The transformation of Donald Nielsen into the Black Panther began in the early 1970s, when he started carrying out armed robberies of sub-post offices across the Midlands and northern England. He chose these targets because they typically contained significant amounts of cash and were often staffed by elderly or vulnerable individuals who would be unlikely to resist. His method was consistent and terrifying. He would enter wearing a black balaclava and hood, armed with a sawn-off shotgun, and demand money while threatening violence against anyone who failed to comply. Nielsen's appearance during these robberies was distinctly intimidating. He dressed entirely in black, from his hood and balaclava to his combat boots, and moved with the silent precision of a trained soldier. Witnesses described him as appearing almost supernatural, materializing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly into the night. This ghostly quality, combined with his dark clothing, led to his nickname, the Black Panther, a moniker that perfectly captured the fear he inspired in his victims and the public. The Black Panther's robberies were characterized by their military precision and extreme violence. He would scout his targets carefully, learning the routines of staff and customers and identifying escape routes. When he struck, it was with overwhelming force and speed, leaving victims no time to resist or raise an alarm. He was not content simply to steal money. He seemed to enjoy terrorizing his victims, often binding and gagging them even when they offered no resistance. Between 1971 and 1974, the Black Panther carried out over 40 armed robberies, stealing tens of thousands of pounds and leaving a trail of traumatized victims in his wake. His crimes escalated in violence over time, with several post office workers being seriously injured during robberies. 3 people were killed during his raids: Derek Aston, security guard shot during a robbery in Harrogate; Leslie Whittle's brother's girlfriend, Sidney Whittle, shot during the Whittle kidnapping; and sub-postmaster Donald Skepper, killed during a robbery in Langley. The murder of Donald Skepper on February 15, 1974, marked a significant escalation in the Black Panther's campaign of terror. Skepper, a 56-year-old sub-postmaster, was shot dead during a robbery at his post office in Langley, West Midlands. The killing was particularly shocking because Skepper had offered no resistance and had been cooperating with the robbery. The senseless nature of his murder demonstrated that the Black Panther was prepared to kill even compliant victims, making him even more dangerous and unpredictable. The police response to the Black Panther's crimes was hampered by the fact that he operated across multiple police force areas, making coordination difficult. Each robbery was investigated by the local force where it occurred, and it took time for investigators to recognize that they were dealing with a single, highly mobile criminal. When the connection was finally made, a major incident room was established to coordinate the investigation, but by then the Black Panther had already evolved into an even more dangerous predator. The case that would make the Black Panther infamous beyond his robbery spree began on January 14, 1975, when he kidnapped 17-year-old Leslie Whittle from her home in Highley, Shropshire. Leslie was the daughter of a wealthy coach company owner who had recently died, leaving her family a substantial inheritance. The Black Panther had been watching the family and planning the kidnapping for months. seeing it as an opportunity to obtain the large sum of money that had eluded him in his post office robberies. Leslie Whittle was a beautiful and popular teenager who had just started her A-levels and was looking forward to a bright future. She lived with her mother Dorothy and her younger brother Ronald in a comfortable home in the affluent village of Highley. The family had been grieving the recent death of George Whittle, Leslie's father, and were still adjusting to their changed circumstances. They had no idea that they were being watched by a dangerous criminal who saw them only as a means to obtain money. On the night of January 14, 1975, the Black Panther broke into the Whittle family home while they slept. He had studied the house layout and knew exactly where to find Leslie's bedroom. He entered through a window, crept through the house, and seized the terrified teenager from her bed. He had prepared for the kidnapping with military precision, bringing tape to bind her and a bag to muffle her screams. Within minutes, he had spirited her away into the night. The kidnapping of Leslie Whittle was discovered the next morning when her mother found her bed empty and a ransom note left behind. The note, written in the same precise handwriting that had characterized the Black Panther's previous communications, demanded APS 50,000 in used notes and provided complex instructions for the ransom drop. The note warned that any attempt to involve the police would result in Leslie's death, but the family had little choice but to contact authorities. The ransom note demonstrated the Black Panther's meticulous planning and his familiarity with police procedures. He had anticipated that the authorities would be called and had designed his demands to make police intervention as difficult as possible. The drop location was carefully chosen to provide him with multiple escape routes and clear sightlines to detect any police presence. He had also specified that the money should be delivered by Leslie's brother Ronald, knowing that the police would be reluctant to put another family member at risk. The police response to Leslie Whittle's kidnapping was immediate and massive. Detective Chief Superintendent Bob Booth was put in charge of the investigation, and resources from multiple forces were mobilized to find the missing teenager. However, the investigation was complicated by the Black Panther's expertise and the strict instructions he had provided about police involvement. Any visible police presence could result in Leslie's death. But without police involvement, there was little hope of catching her kidnapper. The first ransom drop attempt on January 16, 1975, was a disaster that demonstrated the Black Panther's cunning and the difficulty of dealing with such an experienced criminal. Ronald Whittle followed the complex instructions he had been given, traveling to various locations around the West Midlands and following a series of pre-positioned messages. However, the Black Panther detected police surveillance and abandoned the drop, sending another message expressing his anger at the police involvement. The failed ransom drop led to a second attempt on January 21, 1975. But this too was unsuccessful due to what the Black Panther perceived as continued police interference. His messages became increasingly angry and threatening, warning that Leslie would be killed if his instructions were not followed exactly. The mounting tension and the repeated failures to make contact with the kidnapper led to growing desperation among both the police and the Whittle family. Meanwhile, Leslie Whittle was being held captive in conditions of unimaginable terror and deprivation. The Black Panther had taken her to an underground drainage system near Kidsgrove in Staffordshire, where he had prepared a makeshift prison. The location was remote and virtually soundproof, making it ideal for his purposes. Leslie was kept chained to a platform suspended over a deep shaft, in constant fear for her life and completely at the mercy of her captor. The underground lair where Leslie was held demonstrated the Black Panther's twisted ingenuity and complete lack of humanity. He had converted part of the drainage system into a prison, complete with supplies and equipment needed for a prolonged captivity. The psychological impact on Leslie of being held in such conditions, chained underground and completely isolated from the outside world, must have been devastating. The claustrophobic environment and constant threat of death created a living nightmare that would have broken most people. As the weeks passed without successful contact between the kidnapper and the authorities, hope for Leslie's safe return began to fade. The Black Panther's communications became less frequent and more erratic, suggesting that his carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. The massive police operation was putting pressure on his movements, and his inability to collect the ransom money was frustrating his objectives. This mounting pressure would ultimately lead to the tragic conclusion of the case. The discovery of Leslie Whittle's body on March 7, 1975, brought the kidnapping case to its devastating conclusion. Her remains were found in the drainage system where she had been held, hanging from the platform where the Black Panther had chained her. The exact circumstances of her death became a matter of intense investigation and debate, with questions raised about whether she had died accidentally or been murdered by her captor. The post-mortem examination of Leslie Whittle's body revealed that she had died from strangulation, but the precise mechanism remained unclear. The Black Panther would later claim that her death had been accidental, occurring when she fell from the platform while trying to escape. However, forensic evidence suggested that she may have been deliberately killed, possibly when the Black Panther realized that his kidnapping plan had failed and that capture was becoming increasingly likely. The discovery of Leslie's body galvanized the police investigation and led to renewed efforts to capture the Black Panther. The crime scene was examined with unprecedented thoroughness, and every piece of evidence was analyzed for clues that might lead to the killer's identity. The underground lair where Leslie had been held provided valuable forensic evidence, including fingerprints and trace materials that would eventually help to identify her captor. The breakthrough in the case came on December 11, 1975, when two police officers, Constables Stuart Mackenzie and Tony White, spotted a suspicious figure near a post office in Mansfield Woodhouse, Nottinghamshire. The man, dressed in dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a weapon, matched descriptions of the Black Panther. When challenged, he pulled out a sawn-off shotgun, and a violent struggle ensued. The arrest of the Black Panther was as dramatic as his crimes had been. Constables Mackenzie and White showed remarkable courage in tackling an armed and dangerous criminal, risking their lives to protect the public. The struggle was fierce and prolonged, with the suspect fighting desperately to escape. He fired his shotgun during the struggle, narrowly missing the officers, before finally being overpowered and arrested. The man arrested that night was Donald Nielsen, though his identity was not immediately apparent to the arresting officers. He carried no identification and initially refused to give his name or address. However, forensic examination of his clothing and equipment quickly established links to the Black Panther crimes. His fingerprints matched those found at several crime scenes, and his possession of a sawn-off shotgun and other criminal equipment confirmed that the long hunt for the Black Panther was finally over. The interrogation of Donald Nielsen revealed the full extent of his criminal career and provided answers to many questions that had puzzled investigators. He confessed to the kidnapping and killing of Leslie Whittle, though he maintained that her death had been accidental. He also admitted to numerous armed robberies and the murders of Derek Aston and Donald Skepper. His confessions were detailed and matter-of-fact, revealing a man who felt little remorse for the suffering he had caused. The trial of Donald Nielsen began on June 14, 1976, at Oxford Crown Court. He was charged with 4 counts of murder, including that of Leslie Whittle, and numerous other offenses related to his robbery spree. The prosecution, led by Harry Ognall QC, presented a compelling case that painted Nielsen as a cold-blooded killer who had murdered for money and to avoid capture. The defense team, led by Gilbert Gray QC, faced an almost impossible task in defending a man who had confessed to multiple murders. They attempted to argue that Nielsen was suffering from mental illness and that Leslie Whittle's death had been accidental rather than murder. However, the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own confessions had provided prosecutors with all the material they needed for conviction. The trial was one of the most sensational in British legal history, attracting massive media attention and public interest. The story of the Black Panther had captured the public imagination, and his capture and trial were followed closely by newspapers and television. The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public, all eager to see the man who had terrorized the nation for so many years. Donald Nielsen was found guilty on all charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve at least 25 years. The judge, Mr. Justice Mars Jones, described his crimes as being among the most serious ever committed in Britain and noted that he had shown no genuine remorse for his actions. The sentence was welcomed by the families of his victims and by the police officers who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. The conviction of Donald Nielsen brought to an end one of Britain's most intensive manhunts and provided justice for the families of his victims. However, the case also raised important questions about police coordination and the challenges of investigating crimes that cross multiple jurisdictions. The Black Panther case led to significant improvements in interforce cooperation and the development of better systems for tracking mobile criminals. In prison, Donald Nielsen proved to be a difficult and unrepentant prisoner. He showed no remorse for his crimes and continued to maintain that Leslie Whittle's death had been accidental. He attempted to escape on several occasions and was frequently in conflict with prison authorities. His behavior in custody reinforced the view that he remained a dangerous individual who could never be safely released into society. Nielsen's minimum sentence was increased several times due to his behavior in prison and his continued refusal to show genuine remorse for his crimes. In 2008, his sentence was converted to a whole life term, meaning that he would never be released. This decision was welcomed by campaigners and the families of his victims, who argued that someone capable of such calculated cruelty should never again be free. Donald Nielsen died in prison on December 18, 2011, at the age of 75, having served 35 years for his crimes. His death received relatively little media attention, reflecting the fact that he had been largely forgotten by the public during his long imprisonment. However, his crimes continue to be remembered as examples of the extreme violence that some individuals are capable of inflicting on innocent people. The case of the Black Panther had a lasting impact on British policing and criminal justice. It demonstrated the need for better coordination between different police forces and led to the development of more sophisticated techniques for tracking mobile criminals. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of small businesses like sub-post offices and led to improved security measures in such establishments. For the families of Donald Nielsen's victims, his death brought a sense of closure, but could never fully heal the wounds his crimes had inflicted. The Whittle family in particular had been devastated by Leslie's kidnapping and murder, and they never fully recovered from their loss. The knowledge that justice had been served provided some comfort, but it could never bring back their beloved daughter and sister. Thank you for joining me in the darkness tonight on Midnight and Murder. Until we meet again when the clock strikes 12, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the truth is often stranger and more chilling than fiction. Sweet dreams.